In a quiet suburban town in the United States, a young immigrant girl named Aisha arrived with dreams far bigger than her suitcase. She was 12, wide-eyed, and full of curiosity, carrying the hopes of her parents who had left everything behind for a chance at a better life. Her family had moved from Pakistan, a world filled with warmth, color, and chaos, to a neighborhood where everything seemed perfect. Manicured lawns, polite smiles, and silence that felt almost too heavy. From the moment Aisha stepped into her new school, she felt the weight of being different. Her hijab made her stand out. Her brown skin made her visible in ways she didn't want to be. But most of all, it was her accent. That soft, lilting rhythm of Urdu meeting English that drew the sharpest eyes and the cruelest laughter. The first time she introduced herself in class, she felt proud. Her name meant alive. Her mother had told her. But when the teacher repeated it incorrectly, and a few students laughed under their breath, that pride crumbled into something smaller, something she wanted to hide. By the time the day ended, Aisha had already learned one painful truth: her voice, the same one her grandmother had praised for its beauty, was now a target. Each day became a test of endurance. Simple tasks, reading out loud, answering questions, even saying her name, filled her with dread. The whispers behind her, the mocking tones imitating her pronunciation, the snickers when she misused a word, they carved invisible wounds that went deeper than anyone could see. At home, her parents encouraged her to be strong. "They just don't understand yet," her father would say. "You'll show them one day." But Aisha didn't believe him. In her mind, she wasn't someone who would ever belong. She started to speak less and less at school, her once curious mind retreating behind silence. Her teachers noticed her quietness but didn't understand its cause. Some thought she was shy. Others assumed she wasn't smart enough to keep up. They didn't see the way her classmates mimicked her in the hallways, or how she spent her lunches alone behind the library shelves, pretending to read while hiding her tears. Then came the day of the annual speech showcase. Every student was required to give a short talk on a topic they loved. For most kids, it was a fun project. For Aisha, it felt like a sentence. She wanted to disappear. The idea of standing in front of everyone, her accent echoing in that large room while the same students who mocked her watched, was unbearable. That night, she told her parents she didn't want to do it. But her mother, with her calm strength, simply said, "Your voice is not something to be ashamed of, Aisha. It's a story. Your story. Don't let anyone silence it." Aisha didn't respond, but her mother's words lingered. She spent the next week writing her speech, erasing and rewriting it until the paper looked worn and tired. She practiced alone, whispering to herself, trying to soften her accent to sound more like the kids at school. But no matter how hard she tried, her voice was still hers. It carried her heritage, her home, her heart. When the day of the showcase arrived, Aisha's hands trembled as she stood backstage. She could hear the others before her, loud, confident voices speaking with ease, laughter filling the room. Then it was her turn. She walked to the podium, her small frame almost swallowed by the bright lights. For a few seconds, she couldn't breathe. The room blurred. Every pair of eyes felt like a weight pressing down on her. Then, from the front row, she saw her teacher nod encouragingly. Somehow, that small gesture gave her the courage to begin. Her voice came out soft at first, shaky and uncertain. A few whispers rippled through the audience, snickers from the usual group. But Aisha kept going. Sentence by sentence, word by word, she found her rhythm. She spoke about dreams, about courage, about learning a new world while holding on to her old one. Her accent, instead of being a weakness, gave her words a melody that made people listen differently. By the time she finished, the room was quiet, not mocking this time, but thoughtful. She didn't win any awards that day, but when she sat down, something inside her had shifted. For the first time, she didn't feel ashamed of her voice. It was still foreign to them, but it was finally hers again. Later that afternoon, as she walked home, Aisha overheard two girls from her class whispering behind her. One of them said, "She's actually kind of brave." The words were small, almost throwaway, but to Aisha they felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. That night she wrote in her diary, "Today I spoke, and I didn't hide, but deep down." She didn't know that this was only the beginning, because in the years to come, the same accent they mocked, the same voice that once trembled with fear, would one day stand at the front of a classroom, teaching those who used to laugh what it truly means to listen, As the days turned into weeks, Aisha found herself caught between silence and survival. Each morning, she rehearsed English phrases in front of her cracked mirror, her voice trembling as she tried to erase the sound of where she came from. She whispered words she'd heard others say so effortlessly. "Thank you. Good morning. Excuse me," hoping that one day they would sound like they belonged to her. But no matter how much she practiced, her accent lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. School became a battlefield disguised as a classroom. Every time she raised her hand to answer a question, whispers spread like wildfire. Her classmates would wait for her to speak, not to listen, but to laugh. They mocked her pronunciation, stretching her words into cruel parodies that echoed across the room. Even the teacher, Mrs. Parker, would sometimes suppress a smile, pretending not to notice the ridicule that unfolded before her. Aisha tried to tell herself it didn't matter, that one day none of this would define her. But the truth was harder to swallow than she wanted to admit. Every insult chipped away at her confidence. Every smirk reminded her that no matter how hard she studied or how well she understood the lessons, she would always be the girl with the accent. At home, her mother encouraged her to be strong. "Your voice is beautiful," she would say. But Aisha couldn't believe that anymore. She started speaking less at school, afraid that every word would become ammunition. Her grades began to slip. Teachers called her quiet, shy, withdrawn, but no one saw the fear behind her silence. No one understood the ache that came from being mocked for the very thing that made her who she was. Still, there were moments when her spirit refused to die. Late at night, while others slept, Aisha would read books aloud. She loved the way English words rolled through her tongue, heavy but powerful. She mimicked the radio host she heard on her mother's old set, shaping her voice until it carried confidence, not fear. She imagined herself standing in front of a classroom someday, teaching others not just words, but respect. One day, her English teacher announced a speech competition. The topic, "What makes us who we are?" The irony wasn't lost on Aisha. For days, she hesitated to sign up. The thought of standing on stage, speaking while others waited to mock her, made her stomach twist. But something inside her, a flicker of defiance, perhaps, refused to let her walk away. This was her chance to show that her accent was not a weakness, but a story written in sound. She spent nights writing and rewriting her speech. It wasn't about grammar or vocabulary, it was about truth. She wrote about her homeland, the smell of rain-soaked earth, the rhythm of her grandmother's songs, the pride in her family's stories. She wrote about what it felt like to leave everything behind, to start again in a world that didn't understand her. And she wrote about her accent, how it carried her past, her people, her pain, and her power. When the day of the competition arrived, Aisha stood backstage, her palms slick with sweat. She could already hear the faint snickers from the audience as others whispered her name. Her heart raced, but she took a deep breath. She remembered her mother's words, "Your voice is beautiful." When it was her turn, she walked to the microphone, trembling but determined. As she began to speak, the first few sentences came out shaky. Then, as she looked into the crowd, she saw something unexpected, a few faces listening, really listening. Her voice grew stronger. Every syllable carried the rhythm of her roots, every word painted her truth. By the time she finished, the room was silent. For a moment, no one moved. Then, from the back, someone started clapping. Others joined in, hesitant at first, then louder. Aisha felt her heart swell. For once, they weren't laughing. They were applauding. But just as she began to believe that everything had changed, the announcement of the winners shattered that illusion. She didn't win. The prize went to a student who had read a speech about honesty and diversity. Ironically, the same student who had mocked her the week before. The applause Aisha received had been sympathy, not respect. The disappointment burned deeper than she expected. As the crowd dispersed, she overheard a group of students whispering, "She's brave," one said, "but that accent." They laughed again, softer this time, but it stung all the same. Aisha walked home that day with her head high, though her heart felt heavy. She realized that winning wasn't always about trophies. Sometimes, victory was simply refusing to let others silence you. But even then, she couldn't shake the bitterness of being seen as less, of knowing that her words, no matter how powerful, were still filtered through prejudice. That night, as she sat by the window, she made a silent promise to herself. One day they would hear her voice, not as a joke, not as an accent to be mocked, but as something worth learning from. She didn't know how or when, but she knew this: she would rise. She would prove that the same voice they mocked could one day teach them what respect truly sounded like. And as the moonlight fell on her notebook, Aisha began to write again, not just for school, but for herself. Every word she wrote carried fire, and every page she filled brought her one step closer to her destiny. What she didn't know was that life was about to test that promise in a way she could never have imagined. Arjun's days grew heavier with silence. The once bright spark in his eyes dimmed beneath the constant weight of mockery. Each mispronounced word, each suppressed snicker from the back of the classroom, was a reminder that he didn't belong, at least not in their eyes. He had tried everything to fit in: watching videos, mimicking their tone, practicing in front of mirrors until his throat ached. Yet, the more he tried, the more they mocked. The teachers didn't help. Some smiled sympathetically, but most dismissed his struggles as a language issue that time would fix. Time didn't fix it. It only deepened the cracks inside him. The accent that connected him to his home, to the warmth of his mother's lullabies and his father's proud stories, had become his curse. It was during a class presentation that the humiliation reached its peak. Standing at the front of the room, Arjun's palms were slick with sweat as he spoke about a science project he had spent weeks perfecting. But midway through, a voice from the back mimicked him, exaggerated, twisted, cruel. Laughter erupted. The sound filled the room like a storm. Even the teacher struggled to contain it, pretending not to hear as Arjun's voice faltered and died mid-sentence. He stood there frozen, every heartbeat echoing in his ears. His carefully written notes trembled in his hands before falling to the floor. No one helped him pick them up. When he finally walked back to his seat, he knew something inside him had changed forever. That night, Arjun locked himself in his small room, away from the comforting words of his mother, away from the world. The laughter replayed in his mind over and over, each echo louder than the last. He wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe his voice didn't belong here. But as tears soaked the pages of his notebook, another thought began to form, fragile but burning. What if they were wrong? For the first time, instead of trying to erase his accent, he began to listen to it differently. He recorded himself speaking, not to mimic others, but to understand his own rhythm, his own tone. There was music in it, the cadence of his culture, the rise and fall of words shaped by generations. It wasn't broken, it was beautiful. Days turned into weeks, and Arjun began to study in secret. He spent hours listening to public speakers from his homeland, those who spoke proudly, who made the world listen despite their differences. He read aloud in front of a mirror every night, not to sound like them, but to sound like himself. His accent was no longer a flaw, it was a fingerprint. One of a kind. Still, school didn't get easier. The mockery continued, though now he reacted differently. Instead of shrinking, he watched. He began to understand that their laughter came not from confidence, but from ignorance. The more they tried to break him, the more determined he became to rise above them. His parents noticed the change. His mother, who once wept quietly over his sadness, saw a new fire in him, silent but strong. His father encouraged him to use his intelligence as his weapon, not his words. "Let your success speak, Arjun," he said one night. And so, Arjun did. He began entering competitions, essay contests, debates, spelling bees, anything that tested knowledge rather than presentation. His words were still colored by his accent, but his thoughts carried a depth that others couldn't match. Slowly, his teachers began to notice. Some started praising his work privately, hesitant to say too much in front of the students who still ridiculed him. But Arjun didn't need their validation anymore. He had found his focus. By the time the regional science fair arrived, Arjun had built something extraordinary. A project on renewable energy that could help power small rural homes using inexpensive materials. It wasn't just science to him, it was personal. It was a way to honor the village he came from, the place his classmates didn't even bother to pronounce properly. He entered the fair quietly, aware of the same students who had once laughed at him standing nearby with their sleek projects and confident smiles. He felt their eyes on him, the same eyes that once burned with scorn. But now, he didn't flinch. When the judges came around, Arjun explained his project in his clear, accented English. His voice was steady, his words deliberate. Every syllable carried purpose. This time, the accent wasn't something to hide behind. It was a badge of origin, of identity. The judges listened intently, asking questions he answered with precision and grace. By the end, one of them shook his hand, genuinely impressed. The crowd didn't laugh this time. They listened. That night, as he returned home, Arjun sat in silence for a long time. The laughter from before felt distant now, almost irrelevant. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. For every small victory, there were bigger battles waiting. Not just with others, but within himself. The science fair results hadn't yet been announced, but Arjun didn't care. He already knew he had won something greater, the strength to embrace who he was. Yet, as fate would have it, the real turning point was still to come, something that would test not just his confidence, but his compassion. Because soon, the same people who had mocked him would need him, and the world would watch how he chose to respond. As the weeks passed, Aisha's resilience began to waver. The snickers that followed her every word, the deliberate mispronunciations of her name, the whispers about her, broken English. They chipped away at her confidence piece by piece. She had entered this university with a spark of hope, believing that hard work and kindness could outshine prejudice. But every day felt like walking through a storm of silent judgment. She stopped volunteering answers in class. Her once eager participation dwindled into silence. Even though she knew the answers, she couldn't bear the laughter that would ripple through the room whenever she spoke. Her professors, mostly detached, didn't notice the toll it was taking. Or perhaps they did, and simply didn't care enough to intervene. But Aisha noticed everything, every smirk, every mocking glance. It was like living under a microscope, her identity dissected and belittled by those who didn't understand the weight of her journey. The loneliness grew unbearable. The friends she tried to make kept their distance, unwilling to be associated with the girl with the funny accent. And yet, in the solitude of her small dorm room, she refused to let the darkness swallow her whole. She began spending her nights listening to lectures online, mimicking pronunciation, practicing presentations in front of the mirror, and recording herself until her voice no longer trembled. There were nights when she cried quietly, staring at her reflection, wondering if she would ever belong. But beneath the sadness, something stronger was forming, a quiet determination, sharp and unyielding. She realized she didn't have to change her voice to fit in. She only needed to amplify it loud enough that no one could ignore it. Her opportunity came unexpectedly. One of her professors announced a public speaking competition, a prestigious event where students could represent the university. The topic was the power of communication. The irony was almost poetic. Aisha hesitated at first. The idea of standing before hundreds of people, many of whom had ridiculed her, was terrifying. But something inside her whispered that this was her moment, a chance not to prove them wrong, but to prove herself right. She spent weeks preparing. While others practiced their speeches for grades, Aisha poured her soul into hers. Every line she wrote came from experience, the pain of being misunderstood, the courage to stand tall in the face of ridicule, the power of owning one's identity. Her nights were long and exhausting. Between her studies, part-time job, and speech rehearsals, she barely slept. But fatigue was a small price to pay for redemption. She visualized the stage over and over, the bright lights, the crowd's murmurs, the hush that would fall when she began to speak. The day of the competition arrived. She stood backstage, her palms damp, her heart pounding like a drum. She could hear the audience, her classmates, professors, and even those who had mocked her accent. Some whispered, others laughed softly, expecting her to stumble, to fail, to be humiliated once more. But when she stepped into the spotlight, something shifted. The glare of the lights felt like the warmth of truth, and the silence that followed was deafening. She began speaking, her voice trembling at first, but growing stronger with every word. She spoke not with the polished perfection of a native speaker, but with the raw, unfiltered emotion of someone who had fought to be heard. Her accent, the very thing they mocked, now carried a rhythm of pride, a melody of perseverance. Every sentence was a declaration of identity. Every pause carried the weight of her struggle. The audience, at first restless, grew still. Even her harshest critics sat frozen, their smirks fading into awe. By the time she finished, the silence lingered for a few heartbeats before the hall erupted into applause. It wasn't polite or hesitant. It was thunderous, heartfelt, undeniable. Aisha stood there, breathless, tears glistening in her eyes. For the first time, she felt seen. Not as a foreigner, not as a joke, but as someone who had something worth listening to. That night, She returned to her dorm with a heart that felt lighter than it had in months. But she knew this was only the beginning. The applause was satisfying, yes, but she wasn't done. Her victory wasn't about a speech or a competition. It was about reclaiming her dignity. Yet, even in triumph, the world found a way to remind her of its cruelty. The next morning, as the university's online portal uploaded the event photos, hateful comments flooded the page. Anonymous messages mocked her once again, accusing her of playing the victim card, questioning her intelligence, belittling her success. Aisha scrolled through them silently, her heart sinking. The applause had faded, replaced by the familiar sting of prejudice. She realized that one speech couldn't change everyone. There would always be those who refused to see beyond their bias. But this time, instead of breaking her, it fueled her resolve. If they refused to change, she would change the system that enabled them. She would make sure no one else had to endure what she had. And so, with quiet conviction, she began her next chapter, one that would take her beyond the walls of the university and into the world, where her voice would echo far louder than anyone could have imagined. The laughter they once used to mock her would soon become applause that couldn't be silenced. But before that moment of reckoning, she still had to face the hardest lesson of all, forgiveness. The weeks that followed were a turning point, not just for Aisha, but for the entire classroom. The students who once snickered behind her back, who mocked the way she spoke, were now silent during her lessons. Something had shifted. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps it was respect, or maybe it was the realization that her intelligence ran deeper than their prejudice. But still, beneath the surface, traces of resistance lingered. It wasn't easy for them to unlearn the arrogance they had been taught by a world that favored their accents, their appearances, their assumptions. Aisha, meanwhile, had grown stronger. Every word she spoke, every class she taught, carried the quiet confidence of someone who had faced humiliation and chosen to rise above it. She had stopped trying to sound right, by their standards. Instead, she embraced the rhythm of her voice, the slight roll of her R's, the melody of her native inflections. She realized that her accent wasn't a weakness to fix, but a reminder of where she came from and the life she had fought to build. But redemption was never simple. One afternoon, as she was leaving the school, Aisha overheard a conversation that brought back the sting of old wounds. A few of her students were gathered near the gate, laughing softly. One of them mimicked her pronunciation again, not cruelly, perhaps, but thoughtlessly. It was as if mocking her had become a habit they couldn't quite shake. They didn't realize she was there, watching from a few steps away. For a moment, the pain resurfaced. She felt the familiar burn of humiliation crawling up her throat, the urge to run, to retreat. But then, something within her shifted. This time, she didn't turn away. She stayed still, her gaze firm, her breathing steady. These were children. She reminded herself, children echoing the biases of adults who never taught them better. She couldn't control what they said behind her back, but she could control how she responded to it. The next day, Aisha came to class with a new lesson plan, one unlike anything she had done before. Instead of the usual grammar or literature, she brought stories. Real stories. Stories of writers, scientists, and leaders from across the world who spoke English differently, who had accents that carried the weight of entire cultures. She spoke about how English had become a global language, not because of perfection, but because of diversity. As she spoke, something changed in the air. The students leaned forward, their expressions softening as they listened. They began to see their teacher not as a stranger trying to fit into their world, but as someone who had fought harder than any of them could imagine to be there. They began to understand that the voice they once mocked carried not just knowledge, but resilience, sacrifice, and pride. And then a quiet miracle happened. During a reading exercise later that week, one of the same students who had laughed at her accent stood up and read aloud with his own accent, unfiltered and natural. When he stumbled over a word, he smiled and said he wanted to read it the way Miss Aisha does, because it sounds brave. The rest of the class chuckled softly, but this time it wasn't mocking. It was admiration. Word of Aisha's unique teaching approach began to spread through the school. Her lessons became popular among students from other grades, especially those who came from immigrant families. Parents began to notice the change too. Children who had once been ashamed of their parents' accents were now correcting their own behavior at home, showing newfound pride in their heritage. But not everyone was pleased. A few parents, those who had always held quiet contempt for people like Aisha, complained to the administration. They claimed she was making English political and lowering standards. It was the same coded language that had followed her since the day she arrived. Words meant to sound professional but rooted in prejudice. The principal called her into his office one morning, his face tight with discomfort. He said there had been concerns that some parents felt she was influencing students in ways beyond the curriculum. Aisha listened calmly, though her hands trembled slightly. She had feared this moment, the one where her courage would be tested not in the classroom, but in the system that often turned a blind eye to injustice. She didn't argue or beg. Instead, she presented the results. The students' improved engagement, their higher test scores, the letters from parents thanking her for helping their children find confidence. She spoke clearly, her accent pronounced, steady, unapologetic. By the end of the meeting, the principal was silent. He couldn't deny the evidence before him. Perhaps for the first time, he heard her words for their meaning, not their melody. The complaints faded quietly after that, replaced by recognition. Soon, the school featured her in a local newspaper story about innovative teachers making a difference. The photograph showed her smiling before a blackboard, surrounded by her students. To anyone else, it was just a picture, but to Aisha it was proof that she had taken back her story. Yet even as her success grew, she couldn't shake the memory of those early days. The laughter, the whispers, the tears she shed in silence. She often wondered what had changed those students, what had opened their hearts. Was it the lesson she gave, or simply time? Her answer came unexpectedly one afternoon, when she received a letter slipped under her classroom door. It was handwritten, folded neatly, signed only by one of your students. Inside, the words read, "Miss Aisha, I used to make fun of your accent. I thought it made you sound strange. But now I realize it made you strong. You taught me more than English. You taught me respect." She read the letter twice, her hands trembling. The ink was smudged in places, as if written with nervous fingers. That letter became her greatest reward, a reminder that true change begins quietly, one mind at a time. But just as Aisha began to find peace in her new life, an unexpected opportunity arose that would test everything she had built. A prestigious language institute in the city reached out to her, offering her a position to train English teachers. It was a chance to move beyond the small town, to influence others on a larger scale. The offer was flattering, but it came with a difficult choice, leaving behind the school that had both hurt and healed her. The students who had once mocked her were now her greatest supporters. The town that had looked at her with suspicion now called her their pride. As Aisha sat in her quiet classroom, staring at the letter of offer in her hands, she knew this was more than just a job. It was a crossroad between staying where her redemption began, or stepping forward to share her message with the world. And as she looked out the window, at the playground filled with laughter and voices from every corner of the world, she realized that this next step might be the biggest lesson of all. Years passed, and time reshaped everything around her. The once timid immigrant girl who hid her voice in classrooms now stood before thousands, her words carrying the weight of experience, resilience, and hard-earned wisdom. Priya had transformed her pain into power, and her accent, once mocked and belittled, had become her signature, a symbol of authenticity that reached hearts far beyond borders. She had published a book that chronicled her struggles, how the world had dismissed her for her voice, her skin, her name. It wasn't written out of vengeance, but out of truth, the kind that burns slowly yet heals. The title was simple yet powerful, The Voice They Tried to Silence. It became an international bestseller. Universities invited her as a guest speaker. Corporations sought her for diversity training, and even government bodies referenced her story as an example of overcoming prejudice through persistence. But the sweetest irony of all came when she was invited to teach at the very institution where her accent was first mocked. The elite private school where she once sat trembling before cruel classmates and an indifferent teacher. The same polished halls that once echoed with laughter at her expense were now filled with the sound of her confident, commanding voice. The staff had changed, but the culture hadn't shifted entirely. There were still whispers, still those who saw her as an inspirational diversity token, someone to parade but not truly embrace. Yet Priya knew how to handle such subtle prejudice now. She no longer shrank under it, she stood above it. She taught not only language but empathy, weaving lessons of compassion and awareness into every word she spoke. Students from every background began to adore her, not for her flawless grammar or accent, but for her honesty and heart. And then came the moment that truly closed the circle. One afternoon after class, she received an email from a name she hadn't seen in years. Melissa Harper. The same Melissa who had mocked her mercilessly for her pronunciation back in school, the one who had humiliated her during that fateful presentation. The message was short, written with evident shame. Melissa admitted how she had carried guilt for years, how she now had a son who struggled with speech issues and faced bullying. She confessed that watching Priya's viral TED Talk about embracing your voice had made her cry, and she wanted to thank her for teaching her what she had failed to understand as a child. Priya stared at the screen for a long while, the old pain flickering faintly in her chest like an ember refusing to die out. Yet, she didn't feel anger anymore. Instead, she felt an odd calm, an understanding that true justice wasn't revenge but growth. The tables had turned not because she sought vengeance, but because she refused to let hatred define her story. She replied with kindness, not because Melissa deserved it, but because Priya herself deserved peace. She wished her well and ended with a line that echoed deeply in her heart. What once hurt me became what healed me. That night, as Priya sat in her quiet apartment, she reflected on the long journey she had taken. She remembered her first days in the country, the confusion, the ridicule, the ache of being unseen. She remembered crying silently in the school bathroom, clutching her notebooks tightly as if the words inside them could protect her from the cruelty outside. And now, here she was, shaping the minds of a new generation, guiding them toward compassion and respect. Her accent, once branded as broken, now carried the rhythm of survival. It wasn't broken. It was blended, a symphony of the old world and the new, a sound that no one could mimic because it was hers alone. When she spoke now, people listened, not just to her words, but to the emotion that filled them, the years of endurance that gave them weight. In one of her final lectures of the semester, Priya stood before her students and told them something she had never dared to admit aloud before. She explained how words had once been used to cage her, how language had been weaponized to make her feel inferior. But language, she told them, was not owned by anyone. It was a living bridge, and every accent, every imperfect syllable, was proof of courage. As she spoke, she saw tears glimmer in the eyes of several students. Among them was a young boy from another country, one who had been teased earlier in the term for mispronouncing words. He looked at her as if he had found hope for the first time. And in that gaze, Priya saw herself, the frightened girl she once was, finally finding comfort. The applause that followed wasn't loud or frenzied, but heartfelt. It wasn't the applause of admiration. It was the applause of understanding. After class, she walked through the hallways, her footsteps echoing softly against the polished floors. The same walls that once confined her now bore her framed photograph, placed proudly among the school's distinguished educators. It was surreal, yet deeply satisfying. Life had a poetic way of mending what it once broke. As the sun dipped below the horizon, its light filtered through the tall windows, bathing the corridor in gold. Priya paused for a moment, closing her eyes. The sound of laughter from students filled the air, not mocking laughter, but genuine joy, the kind that once seemed impossible to her. She smiled. Her story had come full circle. The girl they once silenced now taught others to speak fearlessly. The accent they ridiculed became a melody of triumph. The prejudice that tried to break her only carved her into something stronger. And in that moment, as she stood bathed in golden light, Priya realized that her greatest victory wasn't owning her pain. It was transforming it, because the truest revenge isn't in proving others wrong. It's in becoming everything they said you couldn't be. And she had done exactly that.